You are Andrew Jackson, and you're having to deal with a problem, the likes of which you had never imagined having to deal with as president. It seems almost petty, even to describe, but its consequences were far from petty. So here's the story. Andrew Jackson, you're elected in 1828. You come to Washington and you bring, some of people that you've worked with in the past. This is common practice. So you get elected and you staff your administration with people that you've worked with, people that you trust, people that you think have the talents required for the jobs. One of these is John Eaton. John Eaton, a fellow Tennessean. His relationship, his friendship with you goes way back. And John Eaton is appointed Secretary of War. This is an important position in the Jackson administration. And that's okay. Nobody objects to John Eaton, really. But some people object to John Eaton's wife, Margaret Eaton, known as Peggy Eaton. And the thing that they object to Peggy Eaton about is, well, I'll just describe Peggy Eaton and you can draw your own inferences as what they were objecting to. So Peggy Eaton was young, she was vivacious, she was good looking in a way that, I hate to sound so stereotyping in this regard, but this is what happened. She was younger, prettier, more vivacious than the wives of the other cabinet members. Okay? This is simply a statement of fact that everybody at the time acknowledged. Now, is that what the other wives, because this is where this is going, is that what the other wives of Jackson's cabinet officers objected to about Peggy Eaton? Well, that's not what they said. What they said was that they didn't like her scandalous background. Peggy Eaton, unlike most of the wives of Jackson's cabinet members, had not grown up in very comfortable circumstances. Her father had been an innkeeper. He ran a hotel. And Peggy worked in the hotel. She worked at she worked in the bar. She, served the guests, the customers. And so the story was circulated that she became too close to some of the guests, that she was a floozy. If not, and this was not a term that the wife of John Calhoun, for example, would use, or that other members of the cabinet would use, that she was a whore. And so the wives of the cabinet members, other than John Eaton, refused to socialize with Peggy Eaton, refused to attend receptions that she hosted. If she went to a dinner to which they all were invited, if they saw her, they would leave, or they wouldn't go in the first place. So there was a social boycott of Peggy Eaton. It was said, they said, because of her lower class background, because of her shady, scandalous background. And the idea that people were supposed to draw from this was, well, if somehow we associate with this low woman, then it will tarnish our reputation, so therefore we will not. Now, this was a squabble among the women of the cabinet. And you, Andrew Jackson, thought, I don't want to have anything to do with this. You just wish this problem would go away. But it didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. And the ostracism of Peggy Eaton sort of spread throughout Washington. And in the case of your administration, it essentially paralyzed your administration. You could hardly get a cabinet meeting together because the wives would say, well, you can't be meeting with the husband of that floozy. And so here you are, Andrew Jackson. You are the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. You smote the British and saved the United States at that final battle of the War of 1812, but you cannot apparently crack your cabinet into line. So what do you do about this? Well, what are your options? you can't very well order the wives of your cabinet members to do anything. They don't work for you. Conceivably, you could order them to do stuff. At the extreme, you could fire them for being nasty to Peggy. Now, the other possibility is you could quietly ask John Eaton to resign, to go back to Tennessee and take Peggy with him. Now, this is something you don't particularly want to do because you don't think that Peggy did anything wrong. And you don't think John Eaton did anything wrong. And you're somebody who likes to stand by your friends. John Eaton had stood by you in the past, and you want to stand by John Eaton. But people who'd been around politics, especially national politics in Washington, longer than you, they pull you aside and they say, Mr. President, I understand how hard this is for you to do. But there comes a time when personal loyalty, admirable as it is, has to give way to the interests of the administration, the government, the country. We cannot be in a position where you let this squabble among the women paralyze the country. So, what do you do? Here's what Andrew Jackson did. Andrew Jackson stood by Peggy Eaton, stood by John Eaton. And in fact, his administration was paralyzed for months at a time. It caused him to tear his hair. But Andrew Jackson would not be bullied into going against his personal code of conduct. And he thought that he was being bullied. These people were trying to bully him, starting with the women, but he blamed the members of the cabinet as well for this. You know, they should have, basically he thought, they should have stood up to their wives and said, you're not going to tell me what to do. And this is, so you took this position that Peggy Eaton was in the right on this. Now, some of this reflects your own personal experience. Your mother died when you were a teenager. She died as a result of contracting illness, rescuing you from a British prisoner of war camp during the American Revolutionary War. You were one of the youngest soldiers riding on the side of the revolutionaries. You were a courier, you in your early teens, and you were taken prisoner, and your mother came to get you out of the prisoner of war camp. But in doing so, she became ill, and she died. And so in your mind, your mother had given her life for you. And as a result of this, you held women in very high regard. You had held your wife, Rachel, in high regard. And you had stood by Rachel when she was criticized, when she was slandered by your political enemies. And in the election of 1828, Rachel had suffered under the criticism, under the slanders of your, Andrew Jackson's, political enemies, who had said the most horrible things about her personal background. And as a result of this treatment in the press and by speakers for your opponent, John Quincy Adams, Rachel, your wife, your beloved wife, had suffered a nervous breakdown, which became a physical breakdown. Rachel Jackson, your wife, died under the force, under the punishment of this unwarranted criticism. So this is what you, Andrew Jackson, bring to this decision about Peggy Eaton. You will not be cowed into believing the bad things that are said about her, or even acting as though you did. And so you stand by Peggy, you stand by John Eaton. And as a result of this, in fact, your administration is paralyzed for many months. Finally, after a long time, you get several members of the cabinet to resign and you sort of start over again. But this is one of those cases where a decision that's made on personal grounds, and for the most admirable personal grounds, might not have been the best decision for the country. Sometimes as president, You have to make concessions to your personal code of conduct in order to put the public interest foremost.